So we have created our API, we have designed it, and we've said which method and what resources we wanted. Now we need to deploy our API. And so here's a common misconception, is that when you make changes in the API gateway, it does not mean they're effective right away. For this, we need to make a deployment, and they can be in effect after we deploy these changes. And so it's a very common source of confusion, and I believe the examination asks about it quite a bit. Now, when we deploy a change, we deploy these changes to called stages, and we can have as many stages as we want, and we can use whatever naming we want for stages. So we could be dev, test, and prod, beta, whatever you want. You're free to name your stages, and you can have as many stages as you want. Each stage will have its own configuration parameters. Each stage will be independent from one another, and the stages will have a history of all the deployments made to them, so you can roll back a deployment if it doesn't work out. Okay, so now we've seen we have dev, test, and prod as stages, and we can deploy to stages. Now, why do we use stages? We use stages because we can have stage variables. And so these stage variables are going to be like environment variables for our API gateway. And so using these stage variables, we're going to be able to change them, and they will drive changes into configuration values. So it's a bit abstract, but they can be used in Lambda function ARN, HTTP endpoints, parameter mapping templates, and so on. So use cases for stage variables, and we'll see them in action in the next slide, is that we can configure the HTTP endpoint that our stages talk to. So for example, if you have a dev stage, then you can talk to dev HTTP API. If we have a test stage, then we can talk to the test HTTP API, and so on. We can pass configuration parameters down to the Lambda functions using mapping templates. So the stage can be passed down all the way to the Lambda function. And so the Lambda function knows if it's in dev, test, or prod. And for example, the stage variables, they will be accessible to the context object in AWS Lambda as well. So we have different ways in AWS Lambda to get back these stage variables. So how do we use them? A very common pattern of using the stage variables is to use them with Lambda aliases. So you remember, Lambda aliases were pointing to Lambda versions, and so we can use a stage variable to point to a specific Lambda alias. And so our API gateway automatically will invoke the right Lambda function based on the alias pointing to the stage variable. So let's make it concrete with a diagram. We have our Lambda function, and it has 7 versions, right? 6 versions have been snapshotted, and we are working on the latest version. We've created aliases just like before. We have dev, test, and prod. And so dev is pointing to latest, test will be pointing to version number 5, and prod is pointing to version number 2. Now we want to expose all these aliases into an API. So we'll have an API gateway, and it will have 3 stages, and in parentheses are the variables. So the dev stage will have a variable called alias, and it's just me defining a variable named alias equals dev. And so by doing this, and by configuring my API gateway correctly, we can have my dev stage point to my dev alias in AWS Lambda. And then we can have my test stage using the alias equals test point to my test alias Lambda, and so on for prod. And so using these stages and these stage variables, we're really able to modularize how we want our stages to behave and which Lambda functions we want them to invoke. So it is a very common exam question around the use cases of stage variables. Just understand they're like environment variables, and so environment variables can change the code behavior. Stage variables can change what the API gateway does or points to. Now, finally, when we deploy an API, we sort of want to test a little bit the improvements of our API before going all in. And so this is called canary deployments. And canary deployments can be used at any stage, but usually it's done when you go to production. And so you choose the percentage of the traffic the canary channel or canary deployment receives. So here's an example. We have V1 of our API and V2 of our API, and they all talk to a backend in different ways. It's free to talk however it wants. But so our client maybe will redirect 95% of our traffic to the V1 API and only 5% to our canary channel. And so using this, we're able to just have 5% of the request channel through, and we're able to have logs and metrics separate. And so using these log and metrics, we can ensure that our API gateway is not having any error responses, that our clients are happy, that everything works great with our V2 API. And so when we're ready, we can increase the version of our API gateway and shift all the traffic to V2. And so that's the purpose of canary deployments. You're able to test 2 versions at the same time. Now it is possible for you in the canary stage to override stage variables, so you're really free to customize as you want. And so this is sort of a blue-green deployment with AWS Lambda and API Gateway because you're able to test two versions at the same time and compare how things work. So let's say for deployments, I'll try to make it as concrete as possible in the next lecture with the hands-on.